This next panel is going to be focused on American interests and American values around the world. I am Ben Domenech. I'm editor-at-large at The Spectator, and I'm joined today by Kori Schake, who is a senior fellow at AEI, and Brad Lipps, who is the CEO of the Atlas Network, for this discussion. I have a number of questions on a number of topics myself, but if you are interested in asking a question, you can tweet it by using the hashtag, is it FP2022? And so we may take a look at that at the end of our conversation. But first off, just to open things up, there's a huge conversation that's been happening about the redirection of foreign policy in America, particularly within the coalition of the right, broadly understood. That there were some certain values and certain things that I think were kind of taken for granted as being built into the DNA of the center-right coalition that have been questioned in recent years. I'm curious as to both of your perspectives on what's been questioned successfully, meaning that it's actually resulted in some kind of shift on the right, and what has actually turned into kind of an ongoing fractious argument as opposed to achieving any kind of resolution or coalescing of an idea around a certain point. Brad, would you like to take this first?
Yeah, I'll try to make some comments. We rarely get into, and actually kind of studiously avoid, talking about how America should project their power in these different countries, but it's fun to kind of walk back and try to take a big look at what's become rather contentious, and to be able to indulge in a little unembarrassed nostalgia for the Reagan years that Ovik referenced, when it seemed that there was success that we could rally around, and a general idea that the U.S. did have a role to play in projecting moral clarity about what a freer world looks like, and calling out those that weren't part of the project, and also having this sort of strategic ambiguity that I think benefited Reagan, where he was perceived as having a big stick, but also had the wisdom to be to show restraint in the way that he approached different contentious issues. And I think that certainly during my time in D.C. these last 25 years, I think we've just been chastened by our inability to actually engage constructively abroad, and that's led to I think a healthy rethinking of how the center-right coalition should be thinking about American power and what we can afford to do, and the consequences of our actions when we do intervene. And it's brought us to maybe a more libertarian isolationist instinct that I think is probably healthier than where we were 20 years ago, but how that plays out in some tricky situations regarding genuine threats to a global order that is flawed but is worth preserving. When we think about China and Russia, it's tricky to see how to overlay some of those Reaganite principles on the real challenges we face today.
Mm-hmm. Kori?
Yeah, I agree with much of that. It seems to me that that the mistakes of Iraq and Afghanistan are going to cast a long shadow over American thinking about shaping the international order, and in particular about the use of military force in shaping the international order. And I think that's a fundamentally healthy instinct. What I notice in public attitudes about this, though, is that what former President Trump was brilliant at, especially in 2016, was raising fundamental questions. Why don't America's allies do more for their own defense? Isn't trade exporting American jobs, especially to places like China? And third, is immigration healthy for the American economy? And I think those are really important questions to raise and also to answer. Mm-hmm. And if I had been doing my job well enough, my mom would have known the right answer to those questions. But what you see after 2016 is a real shift in support of fundamental liberal principles that people have rights and they loan them in limited ways to governments. That defending human dignity, expanding economic opportunity, and making the world a freer and safer place. The fundamental values that institutions like the American Enterprise Institute believe in grow in popularity as people see the consequences of not trying to do those things in the world. And you see, for example, in the Chicago Council on Global Affairs annual polling of American attitudes on this, by 2018, there are 15-point swings in support of strong American connection with our allies, that free trade is good for people's household economies, and that immigration is the lifeblood of innovation and strength in the United States. People may differ on the policies, but those things were in question in 2016, ceased to be in question in 2018. And what I think we see now is that as China becomes more malevolent in the international order and Russia becomes more malevolent, it's reminding my mom why it's nice to hold your friends' hands when the world feels scary, how important the economic tools of shaping the international order are. I mean, what we are hearing right now from America's friends in Asia is that they don't want a grand ideological crusade about democracy, and they don't want to fight a war with China. What they are pleading with the United States for is a strategy to help all of us reduce our reliance on China economically. And so the rebalancing of tools in the American foreign policy toolkit, I think, is what the public is asking for and what America's allies are asking for. There are lots of ways we can do this.
I was with former Secretary of State Pompeo in New Hampshire recently, and he was talking extensively about the idea that he believes that Americans do have an understanding now of the connectedness of the world, and that when things are threatening either our allies, that they still have kind of a natural impulse to want to support them, and that when China is behaving badly, for instance, that's something that can have ramifications for us as well. I'm curious whether you agree with that analysis, because there did seem to be a period of time, whether driven by fatigue over Iraq and Afghanistan or the rest, where the coalition of the right was trending in the opposite direction to that.
I agree. And what I know from the big surveys of public attitudes about military issues that Jim Mattis and I did for our book, Warriors and Citizens, is that the American public actually doesn't, thankfully, because we have great neighbors in Canada and Mexico, we don't think very much about the international order, the use of force in the international system, because we don't have to. We have the luxury of safety ourselves. But Americans pay very close attention to what the leadership is saying. And I think you saw when President Trump was president, him apologizing for Vladimir Putin, him wanting to hold hands with Kim Jong-un. And that does shift public attitudes for a while. But what I think we have seen in public polling of attitudes very strongly supports Secretary Pompeo's judgment that, in fact, Americans, we don't know much about these issues, but our instincts are great. And so watching Russia's terrifying war crimes and aggression in Ukraine, Americans have rallied to support that we should always be on the side of people fighting for their freedom. That fundamental conservative value, I think, has been quite the widespread response to both Russia and China. And it's perked into bipartisan support, particularly on countering China.
And maybe what I just want to add to this is that I do think that we should be reticent to put too much stock in maybe fleeting opinion polls, because I think the American people, and you probably generalize this, that it's not anything particular to America, is that people's first instincts often aren't thinking of longer-term consequences. So I think we all could have made a good case in 2003 about why something needed to be done in Iraq, and we could have made a good case in 2006 as to why we were in a quagmire, and it was this war of attrition that we weren't going to win, and balancing those I think is really important. So I think that part of what I wish our political class was better at was sort of establishing this moral clarity of yes, let's be on the side of good guys where it's pretty clear that there's relative good guys, but let's also be prudent in how we try to help, how we keep a light footprint, and how we keep the onus on those who own these problems the most, and that we don't kind of project and interfere.
Okay, can I contest
Sure.
that a little bit? Because I agree with you that polls are fleeting, but fundamental judgments are not. Nobody's arguing for imprudence in American foreign policy, right? And most foreign and defense policy calls about questions about intervention are actually really close calls. It's a 48 to 52 call on what you do. And so I do agree with you that the how you do it really matters. But the how you do it isn't always a light footprint is the answer to this, right? And I think talking about, being prudent has different meanings in different contexts. It's not always do very little. In some cases, it's do a lot and do it fast
early, right.
in order to set stable conditions for what you want to have happen.
I'm going to respond to your skepticism about fleeting opinion polls with a fleeting opinion poll. I was in New York for election night, and the election night calculus that was done of our a enormous sample size kind of long-running project poll that happens within Fox News. I won't share the exact details, but it's fair to share with you sort of the overall takeaway, which was Republicans are essentially evenly split on the question of support for Ukraine. That they've moved away from being emphatically in favor of it to having increasing portions, and this is borne out in public polling as well, we either the question is phrased different ways, but essentially it's, are we doing too much, the right amount, or too little when it comes to supporting Ukraine? And more of them are drifting into the too much scenario. You've seen expressions of this in members of the Congress, which a faction that might actually be increased in this after this most recent election. What is your take on kind of the Republican Party as being evenly split, even as the Democratic Party and the Democratic electorate is like a 9-to-1 in favor?
Yeah, so I do think you have seen that kind of movement, and I do think it's significant. But I think it has more to do with the burden sharing question than the absolute support for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Namely, if you look at who's helping Ukraine, I mean, the United States is giving 5 times more assistance than Europe combined to assist a European country under siege in a way that our European allies are saying, this is the end of the security order in Europe. So I think it's a reaction to that. It's a reaction to, the German government having argued until the bitter end that energy reliance on Russia wasn't going to be a strategic vulnerability. Mm-hmm. So I think it has less to do with Ukraine itself than the understandable exasperation from the American public that our friends aren't doing as much as we are doing.
Do you share that analysis?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would just perhaps add that one thing that I think is part of the conversation that I think is unhealthy in right of center circles is that there are elements that have become Putin apologists, and that will try to make this equivocation about Russian expansion being sort of similar to NATO expansion. Sure. When they're completely different.
Well, let me give you kind of that straw man argument in order to offer your own responses to it. The straw man argument basically goes, this is something that NATO and Ukraine made happen by antagonizing the Russians or something along that. It's always framed from the perspective of if they had been left alone, or if there hadn't been the possibility kept open of Ukraine joining NATO, then Russia wouldn't have done this. I don't think a lot of serious people agree with that, but it is something that you hear repeatedly from that faction.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that I think just needs to be stated very clearly, that Russian expansion is Russia invading sovereign countries. NATO's expansion is sovereign countries asking for protection from Russian invasion. So those are fundamentally different things.
The conclusion of that straw man argument is that it is perfectly okay for Russia to invade Ukraine, to take a third of its country, and to barbarically torture Ukrainian populations because Ukraine wanted something different than Russia wanted. The fundamental rule of the international order that the United States and its friends built after 1945 was that borders should only change by mutual agreement, not by aggression. And if we concede the point that strong powers can do anything they want, and there is no concept of states' rights in the order or human rights in the order, then, as Bob Kagan said, the jungle will grow back. The world will get more dangerous, not just for countries like Ukraine that could not defend themselves. It will get more dangerous for us, and it will get more expensive because we will have to enforce the order a lot more in order to keep ourselves safe.
I want to, before I shift away to talk a little bit about China, I do want to ask you how significant of a factor you think this attitude is when it comes to NATO and other subjects along those lines. And just to use one example, there was a number of people in the press, in the media, in the broadly speaking, the right, that was skeptical about the Finns and the possibility of NATO expansion, was arguing against it pretty vociferously. But then ultimately the actual vote that took place, when it came down to it, you added Josh Hawley, Rand Paul voted present, and that was it. Like there just was not some kind of big swing in terms of the votes of the Senate. Obviously, there are a lot of new senators who are going to be coming into town, but do you expect this to be a situation where that is a contingent that grows dramatically, or do you believe that it's something that makes a lot more noise than it actually affects the ultimate policy?
I don't expect a big shift in attitudes because I do think there is a strong fundamental support for the fact that free people should join together and share the burdens of defending ourselves. And Sweden and Finland are unquestionably strong countries that have fought to defend themselves and are committing to defend all of us. And I think that's a popular notion for lots of good reasons. So I do think even though Josh Hawley and some others are opposed, I think they're in a pretty weak position because Sweden and Finland are great countries to add to sharing the burden of a common defense.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't have anything to share.
So to shift to China for a moment, I've had a couple of conversations with members of Congress who are concerned that not enough is being done at this stage to harden Taiwan as a target, to make sure that they have all of the tools that they need, and the right tools, not just the fanciest tools, in order to defend themselves. And this is an issue that I know a lot of them care about and are worried about, just in terms of doing the things in advance that need to be done because of the lack of ease and support, just given the island nature of their state. What are your perspectives on what needs to be done right now to support Taiwan? And do you think that generally there's the right understanding among Americans of how much is at risk and how much of a security danger it is to our allies and to American interests should China take Taiwan?
Yeah, so I agree with the judgment that one of the important lessons to learn from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is helping free societies to strengthen themselves in order to deter attacks is a cost-effective way to enhance all of our security. If we had helped Ukraine more in advance of Russia's invasion, Russia might not have invaded and Ukraine would have been better prepared. So I do think we should all take a careful look at what does Taiwan need in order to better defend itself, and what changes and investments do we need to make in order to assist them. Because if China were to successfully conquer Taiwan, it would not only be a tragedy for the people of Taiwan, it would rattle everybody else, and the security order would become more expensive, and we would all become less prosperous because trade and investment would be impeded. So the things the United States needs to do, first and foremost, Congress needs to pass the defense budget on time. The combination of inflation and the continuing resolutions, because Congress hasn't passed the budget on time, have entirely eroded the additional $48 billion that Congress gave to the Defense Department this year. The good order and discipline of congressional action is something huge and important. I know it's not as exciting as buying submarines or aircraft carriers, but it dramatically affects our ability to buy submarines and aircraft carriers. So that's one thing. Second thing is thinking carefully about how difficult it would actually be for China to cross 100 miles of ocean and make an amphibious landing. That's hard to do well. That's the Normandy landings, and possibly even more difficult. But there are things Taiwan needs to do to think about mining its harbors in times of distress, for the US to think about how do we cooperate with the Taiwanese to get them ready for what might be necessary. How do you resist an amphibious operation? The United States Marine Corps knows a lot about that. And helping the Taiwanese in those kinds of, it's not buying fighter planes, and yet it makes a huge difference, as Ukraine has shown, in defending itself.
Yeah, it's certainly outside my area of expertise about how Taiwan can prepare for this in specifics. But I do think that sort of an overriding goal of our foreign policy needs to be to be supportive where we can, to make sure that this is a real tough porcupine to swallow, and that we are able to not escalate tensions and allow Xi to continue to talk about Taiwan as Chinese, and I don't think it's smart for us to pick battles, but to allow that rhetoric while also being on the side of Taiwan and making it clear that it's a big thing to bite off. And I guess the thing I'm most grateful for in 2022 is just that the Ukrainian resilience, I think, has made those temptations in Taiwan much less attractive. I thought that if that domino fell really quick, that we'd certainly be facing this situation in Taiwan that we all fear. I think that dictators have been chastened in 2022 as well.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about language related to this. Clearly there is a demonstrable, a measurable increase in the quote-unquote America First language that we hear from politicians today in the kind of aftermath of Trump. And yet that really is poorly defined. It's used to refer to a lot of different things. What's a way to sell a kind of an aggressive support for Taiwan, a serious support for Taiwan, as being within the aspect of putting Americans first and their interests first, as opposed to just essentially just saying to the American people and to reluctant conservatives, we want to send a lot more money overseas?
Yeah, it's a really important challenge, and I appreciate you raising it, Ben. I favor the way George Shultz, former Secretary of State in the Reagan administration, talked about it, which is that the most cost-effective American foreign policy is tending the garden. You pull weeds as they sprout rather than letting them overgrow the garden. And by defending Taiwan, by assisting Ukraine, that solves problems when they are smaller and more manageable than if Russia succeeds in overturning the European security order, or China is able to conquer Taiwan and cause concern among every other Asian power that they too are going to be at risk. So you solve problems when they are smaller and more manageable, and that is also the lesson of the run-up to World War II, right? There were things we could have done without American direct involvement to help European countries arm themselves and fight Germany and the Soviet Union sequentially. And because we didn't, those problems became enormous in magnitude, and we had to solve them directly. And so I think the argument I would make to reluctant Americans is, if you don't like the cost and the risks of defending an international order that has made us safe and prosperous, you are going to like a lot less the costs of managing these problems when they're bigger.
Yeah, this goes a little bit more to the kind of work that I'm involved in on a day-to-day basis, in helping organizations that embody free society values in different parts of the world to tell their stories. And it makes me think of how I think it was Ovik earlier that was saying that we can't be an ideology that is about leave me alone. I remember just loving what the Students for Liberty organization did in kind of recasting the old Gadsden flag, "Don't tread on me," and putting a different slogan at the bottom, "Don't tread on anyone." That we do have our love of freedom is not just selfish; it's about a love of freedom for others. So part of what I wish we did more as a movement, because I think it would help our positioning and help build the kind of moral support if there are bigger foreign policy challenges in the future, is in celebrating the stories of people like Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, and raising awareness of how authoritarian regimes like we now have in China are completely inimical to free society values, and to draw those distinctions in a way that's more clear. And I think that there's something really wonderful that can be gained if more of us in this center-right community are recognizing how these stories play out, and how there are people working on behalf of human dignity and liberty around the world.
I want to ask about your reaction to the sort of lessons taken away from the final days in Afghanistan. Looking back, doing the research for this election coverage, it was interesting to me that was the exact point where the president's approval rating flipped, where you can see the two lines intersect essentially right there in the wake of Afghanistan's fall, and they never recovered afterwards in terms of crossing back over in terms of the polling average. What do we take away from that? What's the lesson that we take away from that? Because it certainly doesn't mean that Afghanistan becomes a more popular war in retrospect. It's certainly not indicative of the American people saying, we needed to go back there, we need to throw more money at this problem. But it certainly does seem to be an indication that Americans really do not like for our nation to be embarrassed on the world stage in such a way. What is your takeaway from that? What do you think is a lesson to be taken away from that for us?
So I think one of the reasons Joe Biden got elected in 2020 was a public belief that calm competence was what they were voting for when they
chaos
voted
fatigue.
Yeah, chaos fatigue. And what we all saw with the humiliating abandonment of Afghanistan in August of 2021 was, whatever you thought about the war in Afghanistan, Americans didn't want it to end looking like people trying to cling to the wheel wells of departing aircraft. And I think it dramatically dented the administration's reputation for governance. And I think they have justifiably not been able to recapture it.
Yeah, I think that there was the short-term takeaway that being incompetent is bad, that there was a way to exit that would not have resulted in leaving all of our military equipment and so on, and so many people stranded that it was just, it was an embarrassment for the country. The other thing, I think there is this sort of longer-term question about what do we learn from that whole adventure, and I'm telling some friends in the room over dinner last night that I really appreciated coming across something that Christopher Hitchens said back in 2010 or so when he was pessimistic about our involvement in Afghanistan, although he'd certainly been sort of with the interventionist side at the beginning of the War of Terror. But he made this distinction, should we have done what we did and decided that Afghanistan was going to be a base for America projecting power, or were we going to have like a base in Afghanistan with a much more limited role? In the former case, you're sort of taking ownership for getting things right and installing something lasting. You might have thought differently that our goal was really just to avoid the worst case scenario of Afghanistan becoming a haven for institutionalized terrorism again, and you might have had a lighter footprint of special ops folks that were taking out specific targets if they got traction, but without taking responsibility for creating, Switzerland in Central Asia, because those ambitions were proved a little bit too arrogant.
A little too lofty. I wondered if there were any questions from the audience. Yes.
What is the purpose of U.S. foreign policy today, and what is possible for us to accomplish? If you look back from a historical
It's a very
perspective,
small question.
it's a small question, but I think we need to address this kind of question before we get into the tactics of the how. I heard Jake Sullivan at the Council on Foreign Relations the other night. I think he was completely incomprehensible. He said things that were so patently lacking in credibility and contradictory, it showed that we are in a state of disarray. So I'll give you an example. He said, well, carrying the administration's line, somebody asked him about Ukraine. If Russia uses nuclear weapons, what's going to happen? So standard answer, well, that's going to create an uncontrolled escalation that will lead to Armageddon. Next question. No discussion of, is it in our interests to be even thinking about, and is it credible in any way facing somebody like Putin, to be pretending that we are going to come to the rescue and participate even in any European NATO member protection nuclear response sorry.
Can I just
for a non-NATO member and in a country that has not come close to qualification
So the purpose
for
of
NATO.
American foreign policy is to keep the United States safe and prosperous. That's the point. The United States is likelier to be safe and prosperous if other countries are democratic, right? That governments are representative, they respect individual rights and human liberty. And the tradecraft of American foreign policy is deciding when it is cost effective to advance that extension of liberty, right? And sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's cost effective.
Well, can I just to follow on something that he raised there? I have been very frustrated with what we've seen from this administration when it comes to the possibility of nuclear use in this scenario.
Yeah.
It's obviously been widely reported that the message has been sent, or the message that Russia has received, is that rather than use a nuke in response, according to our normal, long-standing deterrence policy, that we've said, essentially, well, we'll just escalate in more conventional fashion in Ukraine. What do you think of that decision? Because from my perspective, that just seems very backwards, and the idea that we would sort of send a message that, well, we won't nuke anything in response, we won't nuke a ship, we won't do anything, on the same level, seems unwise.
So I agree that the administration's messaging has been a mess and that it is unhelpful for American security, for the President of the United States and his leading advisors to be wringing their hands in public, anxious about the end of the world. A better way to handle that, and one that I think threads the needle of your concern, Ben, is to say, if Russia were to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, Russia would be a global pariah, right? That no country has done that since 1945. And our intelligence has been pretty good about Russian military actions so far. If we get any hint in our intelligence that Russia is planning to do this, moving weapons into position, we will publicize that information internationally. We will give Ukraine the weapons and the intelligence to interdict that Russian use before it occurs. That is, allow Ukraine to preempt Russian nuclear use. If we are nonetheless unsuccessful in preventing a Russian nuclear use in Ukraine, we will lift any restrictions we have on Ukraine's ability to target Russian territory. And we will assist in the hunting down and bringing to justice of everyone who was involved in making that decision or carrying out that order. Because I think what we are trying to do is prevent Russia from making that choice. Mm-hmm. And if we can't prevent Russia from making that choice, to increase the difficulty of the Russian military's willingness to carry it out. And the last thing I would say is I agree that putting so much emphasis on the nuclear weapon itself rather than the aggression encourages proliferation. Mm-hmm. And so we ought to instead say any country that uses, that attacks the United States or its allies, that government won't stay in power. Mm-hmm. Because one of the challenges of retaliating against nuclear use by Russia or China is that in societies that aren't free, the public doesn't get a choice on that, and the government doesn't actually care how much damage you do to their public. So threatening the regime, I think, is more effective.
Brad, just to follow on his point, when it comes to American foreign policy, do you believe that we are operating from a position that understands the realistic limits that we have, or do you think that we've kind of adopted a more naive foreign policy under this administration?
Yeah, well, I guess that's been the interesting evolution. I think over time, part of what is different from the Reagan era is that we've been chastened over and over again about the limits of our own power, and then we see the limits of Russians and others who are trying to project influence, and it's difficult to make that last. So I do think that part of what's actually somewhat healthy is to be restrained in our ambitions, and I think that maybe the big challenge is how can you accept that and maybe make. I think it is like worthwhile to have these conversations about what prudence looks like, while still being a voice of moral clarity in the world and still calling out illiberalism and being able to confront real threats when they exist.
You know, I could talk to you both about this for another hour, but I want to be respectful of the time limits that we have. I want to thank you, Kori, and I want to thank you, Brad, for an interesting conversation, and one that I think is going to be of the utmost importance for the incoming new generation of leaders who are going to be showing up here in the coming months. So thanks to you both. And thanks to all of you.